Welcome, fellow child of Adam, to this week's short sermon. That has been a while coming now since the Fallout TV show is a few weeks old at this point, but I was working on a large project, meaning I finally get to talk about the TV show now. There is a lot to say. Some of you have asked me to give my thoughts, and now that we have had plenty of time for the community and the creators to both comment on what we think of the show, the lore implications, and whether it's any good. Since the writers and creators referenced the good, the bad, and the ugly several times in interviews and named it as an inspiration when creating the show, I think it's only appropriate that I structure this discussion in much the same way. So I want to talk about the good things about the show, the bad things, and the ugly things. I will be considering both the lore implications, since that is my wheelhouse, but also just the show on its own merits, because to look at one without the other is to get an incomplete picture. This will be spoiler heavy. If you don't want spoilers, come back to this after you've watched the show. So, crank up the rads, and let's get to it. To be upfront about my overall opinion and impression of the Fallout TV show, I like it, as it appears the majority of people did. I am very positive from a show perspective, and quite positive from a game and lore perspective as well. The details are coming, but because I do think it is good overall, the bad section will have the fewest points. I'm trying to keep my criticism substantial and from being nitpicky, but there will invariably be some of that. Starting with the good, I am going in general order of what I thought was best to the least so, but anything I talk about in this section is what I consider the strongest aspects of the show. None of these are considered weak or meh. This isn't the meh, the bad, and the ugly after all.
Okie dokie.
Probably the single strongest attributes of the new Fallout series are the props, costumes, makeup, and set design. Regardless of whether you liked the show or not, it is inarguable that even the smallest of items were carefully chosen or outright recreated after the exact 3D models in Fallout 4 and 76. Some may not prefer the late game's aesthetic, preferring either the Fallout 3 and New Vegas generation, or even the first games and how they portrayed the world objects, but it's beyond debate that the representation was deliberate and very well executed. The terminal hacking screen where Norm is investigating Vault 31 is just straight from the games. Cooper is seen with a Tesla magazine on his lap that we have all seen in Fallout 4, and there's even stuff from earlier games. Cooper is seen reading an article from the Capitol Post introduced in Fallout 3. We see an anti-war or anti-nuclear piece of graffiti only seen in Fallout New Vegas, and we even see written on the wall, "Jet Rocks," which is graffiti we see in Fallout 2. Basically everything about the vaults, from the doors to the TVs, hallways, even the atom-damned lamps, look great. They even use the same sound effects from the games of doors opening and closing, some of the dog meat sounds, and that always reassuring sound of a stim pack being used. The makeup looked great, and I thought Roger the Ghoul's appearance, where his skin has sloughed off, exposing his bare skull on his forehead, is just super gross and really well executed. There is simply no way these aspects could have been done better, making it a continual visual spectacle and a treasure hunt scene to scene for us fans, and a novel and interesting environment for newcomers who are unfamiliar with the games. 10 out of 10, no notes. Not far behind the excellent prop and set design are the cast and great acting that is shown by basically every single significant character. Walton Goggins kills it in his role as the Ghoul, and Lucy's character arc is very compelling as she evolves from an idealistic but likable vault dweller to a tough but principled wasteland survivor. Maxon is a complex character making some questionable decisions, but his actor does a great job at portraying the flawed and conflicted character that is kind of failing his way up the Brotherhood of Steel. So really there are valid criticisms of the character, but not really the acting. Lucy's brother Norm and his dorky tall buddy Chet were unexpectedly funny, interesting, and engaging characters that helped make the Vault subplot one of the best in the show. Even the supporting cast did a great job. Ma June and Barv made great exasperated general store owners in Philly, and I'm officially incorporating the "I'm trying to eat my beans, but okay" into my arsenal of quotes. Knight Titus was well done as such an unlikable douche, and the Vault 4 Overseer had me cracking up. particularly at the scene where they are letting Lucy go and he is sawing through her ropes. I consider a mark of good acting to be when I am not pulled out of the show by an actor's performance or delivery, and that they display realistic and relatable emotions to whatever is currently happening around them. Although I only knew a handful of these actors from previous work that they've done, all of them were cast well and did a great job in their roles, which is absolutely imperative for a show to succeed, whether you have a vested interest as a longtime fan or you've never even played the games. My wife, who also enjoyed the show, was mostly interested and invested in the characters, and she felt that the characters and their stories were well done and compelling. Now, one part of the TV show that really hit home with me as a fan was when Norm, Lucy's little brother, and Chet, Lucy's, infatuated cousin, go and explore Vault 32 for the very first time. Vault 32 is dead and destroyed. The original Vault inhabitants all killed each other or themselves in gruesome ways, leaving behind a tragic story that our Vault 33ers slowly start to unwind. Eventually, they encounter messages that were written on the wall like, "We know the truth," and eventually in the Overseer's office a message, "Death to management," with the remains of the Overseer tied up in his office chair. A TV is playing a scientific video on loop of the results of mice becoming overpopulated and the resulting aggression and breakdown of mouse social order as a result. The entire time there is a sense of dread that builds as it becomes clear that the Vault Dwellers died years ago, having fought and killed each other, possibly spurred on by overpopulation and having discovered some hidden secret, which led to the capture and murder of their leaders. This whole sequence of exploring a tragedy in a creepy, decrepit vault reminded me so much of nearly all the vaults that you can explore in Fallout 3, like Vault 92, where the dwellers were driven insane by persistent white noise until they all turned on each other in violent psychotic rage, or Vault 106, which secretly exposed the dwellers to hallucinogenic drugs until they lost touch with reality and started to kill each other, leaving only a few crazed survivors. Norm and Chet exploring Vault 32 was so reminiscent of crawling through the destroyed vaults, piecing together what happened, and the sinister experiments behind them, and I freaking loved it. It definitely didn't mean as much to those that have never played the games, and have been able to crawl through the particularly messed up Fallout 3 and New Vegas vaults, but that is one way it was made obvious to me that the producers had knowledge and love for the games. The last few episodes of the show really pick up steam as all the main characters come together once again, and many of the plot threads start to reach their Season 1 conclusion with all the twists and surprises, but nothing could have prepared me for the very last scene of the final episode. Lucy's captured father escapes in his suit of power armor and makes it across the deserts of California to look upon the cityscape of the one and only New Vegas. The implications are clear, and subsequent interviews with some of the TV show creators have confirmed that the second season will finally show us New Vegas, and we will for sure be getting answers to our many questions about what ended up happening and what the canonical ending for the game was. I am excited to explore New Vegas in this new medium, and I don't think there could have been a more hyped up way to end this first season. But that really only applies to us fans, since I don't even know if newcomers would realize, 1, what city they're looking at, and 2, what the significance is. The last of the good before we get to the bad, which, come on, that's the real reason why you're watching this, is the tone that the show was able to strike. I am far from the first one to say this, but more often than not, the show was able to replicate that unique Fallout tone, that blend of humor with the often ridiculous but horrifying reality of the wasteland. You don't have to take my word for it, the creator of Fallout himself thought that the show did a bang-up job of replicating Fallout's unique tonal blend, and if the guy that brought Fallout out of his awesome and silly brain and into our lives applauds the show's tone, to argue otherwise is to tell Tim, the chocolate man, Kane, that he doesn't know his own game. It is not easy to bounce between scenes of hyperviolence, showing the bottom of the barrel of humanity, and then launch straight into a joke that just lands perfectly. And I think the scene with Cooper Howard and Lucy talking with Roger the Ghoul, who is on the verge of turning feral, is such a good representation of this. Roger has reached the end of the road, out of the chem that keeps him from going feral, and Cooper Howard talks to him in the most human way that we have seen of him yet. Just as we see this glimmer of humanity, Cooper ends Roger with a shot to the head, goes through his pockets, plucks one of the last good teeth Roger had, and then just starts field stripping poor old Roger right there. Lucy confronts him for his shocking actions, of course, to which the ghoul responds by saying sometimes a guy has to eat another guy, and also that it's Lucy's turn to fillet Roger because that ass jerky ain't gonna make itself. You know they nailed it when you are equal parts horrified and disgusted, all while laughing at the same time. So hats off for nailing the tone, one of the things that us Fallout fans love about the games. You are now entering the bad zone. This is a good deal shorter than the good because the show has a lot more good than bad, but I'm going to start off with the worst offender. This critique is more of a lore issue than anything else, and those unfamiliar with the series would never know or care about this, but it does lead into a non-lore related critique. The location of Shady Sands in the TV show is nowhere near where it should be, as Fallout and Fallout 2 has established. In the games, it seems to be right on the border with Nevada, and according to Google Maps would be 180 to 200 miles, or 290 to 320 kilometers away from Los Angeles as the crow flies. LA, also called the Boneyard in the games, is where a majority of the show takes place, so for Lucy and Maximus to travel all the way up to Shady Sands would take a good deal of time, crossing small mountain ranges and deserts over the course of several days. But hey, maybe from the point that Lucy and Maximus started traveling together, they really do cover all this dusty, deserty distance to Shady Sands. But this doesn't make any sense if we map things out using the location that the early games have established. Lucy and Maximus join forces to track down Wilzig's head that has a GPS tracker that had been taken by Maximus's squire, Thaddeus. Early on in their travels together, they encounter the Shady Sands crater, so presumably they have traveled this entire distance here before continuing on to the point where they find Thaddeus. Thaddeus is at a radio station, which is said by the DJ to be at Hollywood Hills, approximately here. So why travel several days out in the desert when Thaddeus himself only went from somewhere in LA to Hollywood Hills? They get the head from Thaddeus, and then Lucy is able to use coordinates she got in Philly to make it to Moldaver. We know Moldaver is at the Griffith Observatory, which is just in a different part of LA, in the exact spot as in the real world, as proven in several shots in the show. Many characters refer to Shady Sands as the, quote, shithole that needs to be crossed in order to get to Moldaver. But why would they need to travel several days out in the desert when Moldaver is in LA proper? Needless to say, there's just no way around this, but this matters most from a lore perspective, and we have to wonder, with the two first games putting Shady Sands in about the same location, and the TV show putting it somewhere far away, which location is canon? To those that are new to Fallout, this specific issue doesn't matter at all, but most of the traveling in the show feels floaty. There's no real sense of placement or direction, with only really recognizable locations like Hollywood Boulevard grounding us viewers in the world at all, and this is a general non-lore weakness of the show. Power armor was a big deal in the TV show, as it should be because it's a big deal in the games. A power armor helmet is front and center on each game cover for Adam's sake, and frankly speaking, Fallout just wouldn't be the same without it. Choosing to represent power armor practically with real suits is actually a decision that I am very happy with, as I think practical effects age much better than most CGI. So while I am happy with that decision, very often the armor looked great. Some scenes in it looked a bit weird, but very rarely did the armor look good when it was opened up to let the pilot in or out. This was most obvious in episode 2 when Maximus is defending his armor from being taken by some hooligans. This several thousand pound suit of metal and servos shakes like a leaf in the wind, and this happens basically every time the armor is open like this. To be fair, this was the most distracting that the armor ever got, and I don't know if there's a great solution for this, but maybe a rigid frame specifically for the scenes where the armor is open and has to be interacted with would alleviate this issue. So I praise the tone and the great balance between depravity, violence, and humor, but that doesn't mean it hit every time. The end of the showdown in Philly has Maximus and his unfamiliarity with power armor getting made a fool of by the ghoul. This leads to him flying uncontrollably at the end, getting roped and lassoed with a tow truck hook, which honestly looked pretty janky and would have been insanely heavy, smashing into some debris and flying off like Team Rocket or something. This is one time where I felt the humor not hitting right and taking me out of it, but at least for me, this was an exception to the rule I spoke of earlier, but it does stick out in my mind, and so I had to mention it. Now on to the really fun stuff. Things that some may consider bad, some may consider good, and others somewhere in between. But they all have one thing in common, and that is that they caused a stir that got pretty heated and wild online. Basically, all of these are lore related, going right over the heads of those not cursed enough to have been fans of this series before. Seriously, no one hates Fallout like its own fans. The first one is that bomb itself.
What was the joke?
I forget. All I know is it was a huge bomb.
The destruction of Shady Sands. Now, this topic has been beaten to absolute death since the release of the TV show, and I'm late with my thoughts, but there are some things I wanted to say. We are at the point where all the hubbub around a potential retcon regarding Shady Sands forced a response by Todd Howard that acknowledged that Shady Sands was not bombed in 2277, as the infamous chalkboard seems to imply. Todd acknowledges that they are threading the needle very closely here, but that Shady Sands was blown up after the events of Fallout New Vegas, and therefore there is no lore issue with the events of New Vegas, which takes place in 2281. Really, it seems the sin that they committed was making a rather ambiguous chalkboard timeline, since many interpreted it to mean that Shady Sands blew up in 2277. There is, however, a clue in the show that this was not the original intent. The Welcome to Shady Sands sign states right on it that it was the first capital of the NCR, and unless people started erecting Welcome to Shady Sands signs at the rim of nuclear craters, it's heavily implied that Shady Sands had some event that caused the NCR to move the capital somewhere else. Perhaps the result of a fall, or maybe more accurately, a decline, as stated on the chalkboard. There are indeed a number of events that are said to line up with 2277, giving the impression that the creators originally intended for that to be when Shady Sands was destroyed. For instance, Lucy attributes her mom's death to a famine in 2277, and we know she was in Shady Sands when it was bombed. However, these events can potentially be explained in a way that is not a hacky contrivance in the second season. It's possible that Hank could have taken his kids back in 2277, instigating a famine in Vault 33 as a way to both explain her absence as well as solidify his power as part of an emergency action to control information and keep people from finding out the truth about his wife and the surface. 5 or so years later, the necessary events happened that led to Hank directly bombing Shady Sands, or perhaps in Vault Tech fashion, they social engineered a way for it to happen with existing groups or factions. The main point here is that either through ambiguity, intentional or not, a lot of confusion was created and later clarified. I think hot on the heels of the Shady Sands issue and what fueled the flames of anxiety related to New Vegas was the state that New Vegas seems to be in both the brief ending of the very last episode and also in the following credits. Vegas looks a little worse for the wear, and although it is a long-distance shot, the buildings look more run down than they did in New Vegas, and the ruins of Outer Vegas are completely destroyed. Or perhaps a new wall was erected around even the outer ruins that were previously outside of the walls of the Strip and Freeside. A closer look at the credits seems to confirm the run-down nature of Vegas, with destroyed Securitrons and even vertibirds littering the ground. Vegas is looking rough in the landscape shot, and if the credit scene is to be believed, things are rather dire. Again, this seemed to fuel fears amongst fans that New Vegas was being retconned somehow in order to make New Vegas destroyed or mostly destroyed. The thing is, if we examine the lore, there's at least one New Vegas ending that could have a result similar to this. Considering the new lore about the fracturing of the NCR, that opens up the entire NCR ending to a wrecked New Vegas as well. Just as a refresher, the Yes Man or independent ending for New Vegas is not a stable one. When beating the game without upgrading the Securitron army, it is said that the Securitrons are hard-pressed to keep the peace and anarchy ruled the streets, and after all the fires died, an independent New Vegas remained. An anarchic Mojave is the result of an independent ending. The fiends rule the Vegas ruins, and the powder gangers continue to raid, all of which doesn't add up to the rosiest picture of New Vegas and the Mojave. Alternatively, if the NCR had won the conflict and came to run New Vegas, it would make sense that New Vegas would fall into chaos if the former leaders, the NCR, were unable to maintain control. The city itself, which was largely sustained by NCR citizens coming to either settle or gamble, could fall on hard economic times, leading to the less than pristine image that we see. There were aspirations amongst the families on the strip that run the casinos, like the Omertas, and in a power vacuum, it is extremely likely that the families could start warring with each other for control. Really, the point here is that given what we know about the independent ending for New Vegas, what the TV show introduced to us in regards to the NCR, and how they have fallen, fragmented, and lost control of the vast lands that they used to rule, New Vegas, looking like this, is entirely within the realm of the lore, both existing and new. As a small side note here, there is the possibility that Mr. House is still alive with an NCR or independent ending, since one of the ways that Mr. House can be dealt with is by disconnecting his cerebral interface. The life support systems will keep him alive still, he's just unable to control the Lucky 38 or any of his Securitrons. And it is possible that Hank McClane is there because he is trying to make contact with House, but that's just speculation based on a valid ending for Fallout New Vegas. The bottom line is that we will have to see what is in store in Season 2, but there are a number of interesting ways that New Vegas can end that make sense with what we're seeing, but we're going to have to wait and debate about it in the meantime. Who started the Great War has been a topic that has been debated for a while, although both Tim Kaine, the creator of Fallout, had always thought it was obvious that China had done it, and the Enclave president in Fallout 2 tells the player that the US had been winning the US-Sino War until the Chinese launched everything they had, and according to him, the US barely had time to get birds in the air. Despite this, there have been hints towards other groups, including the US government, Vault-Tec, and at one point Bethesda had considered making Zayton aliens a possible contender as well, as hinted in some cut content, but that is not officially canon. The TV show made waves though, when there was a very secretive meeting between Vault-Tec, some very large companies like Robco, West-Tec, and others, along with a secret unknown group hiding in the shadows. It was made clear that Vault-Tec has no issues with the prospect of imminent nuclear war, but that they may have had a vested interest in kicking it off themselves. This seemed to mean to many that Vault-Tec are indeed responsible for starting the Great War, as Barb, Cooper Howard's wife, in the pre-war tells the cabal of industry leaders that in order to guarantee Vault-Tec's success, they indeed are willing to drop the bomb themselves. This definitely establishes motive, but does not for sure tell us that Vault-Tec did actually start the Great War by dropping bombs. In fact, there are hints in a number of news broadcasts that China and the US were in the middle of talks and negotiations. In the first episode, a news anchor is heard saying that negotiations in Anchorage have begun to break down. Later, at a party celebrating the wrap of Cooper Howard's Vault-Tec commercials, some Vault-Tec officials can be heard saying that the negotiations in Anchorage are having a big effect on Vault-Tec's pre-sales, and that they'll need to talk to DC to do something about it. This shows that Vault-Tec didn't have to have an actual bomb or drop it. They could simply sabotage any efforts by China and the US to come to a peace agreement, and when one of them felt desperate enough, they would push the button. However, there's some good direct evidence against Vault-Tec physically starting the Great War as well. Barb is fairly high up in Vault-Tec and had been working to get her family in one of the good vaults, aka a management vault. That was probably Vault 31. If Barb knew when Vault-Tec was going to drop the bomb that kicked off the Great War, it is very strange that she would let her daughter be out with her dad in LA, where they would be unprotected and potentially killed by the bombs. This is probably the strongest evidence that she did not have prior knowledge of the Great War, and an indication that Vault-Tec didn't do the literal button push. That's not to say that their underhanded dealings and sabotage didn't end up pushing everyone to the brink. So really, we're back to where we've always been. Vault-Tec is up there on the list of suspects that could have been the ones that started the Great War, but we still don't have a smoking gun. Although many may think there is much more of the ugly to go over, I'm going to end on the changes that were made to power armor, because I think it is the least consequential of all, but this controversy started before the official release of the show. Two big changes were seen. The armor has boosters in the forearms to jet around rather than the big, chunky, and frankly pretty sweet looking jetpack from Fallout 4 and 76. And the T-60 helmet now has a retractable faceplate, where previously the only way to reveal one's face was just to remove the helmet entirely. The addition of these and the expansion of the lore in itself is not a problem, and is something that has happened in all the games ever since the second Fallout. We wouldn't have the Vault experiments if it weren't for Fallout 2, where that bit of lore was added, and the series has been all the better for it. Similarly, I see these new to us, but overall inconsequential lore additions as interesting and worth examining on their own merits. The forearm boosters make sense given the medium of the show. The usual jetpacks are big and would add bulk to already large and difficult to move in power armor suits, so these new boosters are a good way to preserve that functionality without showing an actual jetpack. The lore implications are slight, since this doesn't ruin plots or change much of anything, but on the merits of the boosters themselves, they are definitely a worse option than a jetpack. If a soldier is meant to hold onto or even aim a weapon while using the jetpack to boost around, needing to use your arms to direct your flight would make that hard or impossible. Really, it makes more sense to have a back-mounted jetpack in a combat situation than what we see in the show. Second, the faceplate retracting is another convenience for the show. Having to take off the helmet to reveal who is underneath, like we see at least twice when Lucy meets Maximus, and then when Maximus reveals himself to Thaddeus. This change actually makes a bit more practical sense, the same way that fighter pilots have a separate helmet and oxygen mask. One or the other can be removed as needed, rather than having to remove one entire unit. It does provide an extra weakness, both from an armor integrity standpoint and providing an airtight seal, but the trade-offs could be worth it, and this implementation seems very useful. Again, when considering new lore, we have to think about what we lose against what we gain, and I don't see any losses here. There are a lot of things I would like to talk about that are kind of out of the scope of this video format, like the implications for the Brotherhood, since the group we see in the show are getting orders from the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Brotherhood now has clerics, and it appears that the Pridwin airship from the East Coast is now in the West. Additionally, there is the introduction of an anti-virality chem that I think is a very interesting addition to the lore. There's what the Enclave is up to nowadays, the implications of this cold fusion tech, especially in the hands of the Brotherhood, Vault 4 having posters with Trogs and Mirelurk Kings in their laboratory, and much more. This will have to suffice though, and I'm going to try and work these other points into future videos. But that's it for me today, rad guys and rad gals. Thank you to everyone who is passionately but civilly commenting and discussing here. Thank you to my patrons and YouTube members who support me and make it possible to bring out videos as frequently as I possibly can. Hello to my new supporters, Zav and Boris on Patreon, as well as Good Ol' Welshire and Adam Berry on YouTube. And if you would like to join their ranks, check out the video description or come join my Discord chat. A special shout out as always to my all to Adam top tier patrons: Acrid B, Arctic Snowpup, Gardner Minshew Simp, Tessa Storm, Dommy Double, Tapey Papey, The Alt Vault, Juan Vader, and Good Ol' Welshire. May Adam reward your faithfulness. Stay strong everyone, bask in Adam's glow, and I will see you soon.